This book is written by Charles Dickens in the middle of the 1800s, and it is set in a dirty London. The backdrop of the book is a law case by the name of Jarndyce and Jarndyce. And it is one of those kinds of law cases that have been around for so long that no one really knows anything about its original starting point and where everyone is. Chews lawyers and people involved in the case up and spits them out. We have that as a backdrop for the entire book. The book alternates between a narrator that is not omniscient but is third person. Doesn't know what everyone is thinking, but he knows a lot more than a person observing would know. And then we alternate between that and Esther Summerson's narrative. Esther Summerson we start out and she lives in the home with her godmother, which we find is her aunt. And she is basically raised as though she is a problem. And she is kind of the shame of her mother, who we don't know the story of. And her mother is the shame of her. She is sent away after her aunt dies. And no one really seems to miss her. Her birthday is this horrible celebration. The only friend that she has is a dolly. She has this sort of pitiful life. It reminds me a little bit of Jane Eyre, except for Esther Summerson is very self-deprecating. She does not have any of the gumption and the spunk, but she's just very kind. She's just a very kind person. So she is escorted to a school in which she becomes beloved by all those who know her. And she, doesn't think that she's deserving. And that's just the kind of character she is. She's sort of a saint in this book. But once she graduates or moves on from this school, which everyone is so sad to see her leave and everyone loves her and she just feels so lucky to be so loved, she becomes acquainted with her new guardian and the two other wards in Jarndyce. So Mr. Jarndyce is someone who has taken on the responsibility of Esther Summerson's life. And those of the two wards in Jarndyce, which are Richard Carston and Ada, they go to live at the Bleak house with Mr. Jarndyce. And it is not a Bleak house anymore, but it was previously owned by Mr. Jarndyce's grandfather. And as a result of being involved in the case for so long, ultimately killed himself. And the house is very bleak. And then Mr. Jarndyce got a hold of this house and he's fixed it up and made it jolly. And yeah, he's the kind of character who doesn't really like to dwell in negative emotion. So every time a negative emotion comes into play, he says the winds are in the east. He likes to see the best in everyone. He likes to have a positive spirit. He is involved in the Jarndyce case, but he is not of the Jarndyce case. He doesn't get too thick in it. He doesn't get taken away with it. Richard Carston ends up getting somewhat taken away with it. And we'll see that later on how that plays out, but I'm not going to go into that. We're going to move on to Sir Leicester Deadlock and Lady Deadlock. This is another couple in the story. He's titled, but it's one of the lowest titles. But his wife is just sort of the it girl, and she really sets the tone for everything in her social circles. This provides Charles Dickens with a lot of ways to make fun of the upper class, but also to humanize them. I'm just going to say it. She ends up being Esther Summerson's mother. We learn well into the story.
We should know, dear listener, there's going to be a lot of spoilers here.
I mean, it's just a complete spoiler.
Watch out.
There are always spoilers.
So she ends up being the mother. She did not know of this. This becomes scandalous. And I'm just going to skip through and just say, as we go throughout the story, we see the events unfolding in which the information had by all these various characters throughout London become valuable to one person, and ultimately it's how the lives of all of these characters, Joe the little boy, Mr. Smallweed, George, all of these characters throughout the story become intertwined with each other. And it's really because of not really the Jarndyce and Jarndyce case, but somewhat some of those interactions are because of that, but also because of the fact that Esther Summerson is the illegitimate daughter of Captain Hawdon, who has become this poor man and eventually he dies early on in the story, who was the lover of Lady Deadlock. And this is something that, of course, Leicester Deadlock does not know, and this would not have been accepted in these social circles back in the middle 1800s. And as that drama unfolds, we meet a lot of different characters. And I would say that this story is less plot driven and more about how Charles Dickens uses all these characters to really compare and contrast what it's like for the wealthy during that time and what it's like for the very poor, and how those lives are so intertwined and yet so oblivious to each other in many ways. And, we have what's called Tom All Alone's, which is like the poorest part of London, but it's set right in the center of the wealthier parts of London. And really, Charles Dickens uses this to show those kinds of differences and those kinds of stark, contrasts that were so unjust and so present and prevalent during this time. We also learn of his thoughts on all kinds of social justice issues that we can discuss, and really how he views women, how he views the law, how he views so many things. It was written, in the 1850s, and it was serialized. So you get like 4 chapters. I don't know, maybe quarterly, I would say.
Yeah.
And I think it was about every 4 chapters is what was put in sort of this magazine that people used to read. And a lot of the people who were reading this novel at the time, they were not reading it. They were being read aloud. There'd be like one person who knew how to read, and they would read it aloud to, a group of these individuals who are some of the characters, some of the poor, less affluent characters. And if certainly the wealthier people, I'm certain were reading it as well. But I think as you read the story, you imagine what those readers might have been thinking as they were reading it. And I do have to say, I read this a couple of times. I read it a while ago. Then I read it again, but I then listened to it on audio. And I have to say, if you have never listened to this book on audiobook, you are missing out. It is such a treat. The narrators are amazing, and it really gives you a great idea of how this book, in the hands of a skilled reader, can really come alive. And I highly recommend it. What do you think Charles Dickens was trying to say about taking, for example, Mrs. Pardiggle and Mrs. Jellyby? We have those 2 characters, and clearly they're similar in that they're mothers, but they have very different roles. And I feel like he's, in contrast to the main character, Esther Summerson, trying to say something about where he thinks the woman's role is, or is he? I don't know. I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
I think he's talking about, it's a social commentary. I really do. I think just like think it's a major commentary on the legal practice of the time, and we can apply it now as well. But I think it's a social commentary as to Miss Jellyby, so obsessed and concerned about the world, what's going on in Africa, and the safety and the fortunes of those people, and she's not paying attention to her English kid. I think a lot of what's going on in this book is social commentary about the degradation of England, about how it's not being properly handled and dealt with either by the government or by the people who live there. And so that's one of them. That was, I think, one of the small little parts of it that I felt they were commenting on these mothers as, why aren't you paying attention to your English children?
I think that parents are just overall just criticized pretty harshly in this book.
Yeah.
I think that, I think it's not just women, and maybe it's important to separate out the criticism of parents from the issues of feminism, although it's, difficult to separate them. We have another good example of the problem with parents is Turveydrop, who is the father of the son that Jellyby's daughters ultimately marries. You can see how quickly it becomes difficult to describe relationships here.
Turveydrop is the dance teacher. He's the ridiculous
Turveydrop is the dance teacher, who is always a model of deportment, right?
Right.
Who, he's kind of, he's incredibly selfish. He's like different. He's, rather than being excessively altruistic, he's incredibly kind of selfish and vain, but in a way that, he acts like he's a gentleman. I mean, who else are there? I mean, obviously, Lady Deadlock.
Mr. Skimpole is a father. I mean, Mr. Skimpole is also a father.
Skimpole is a father. Lady Deadlock, she's more forgivable because she, didn't realize her daughter Esther was dead.
Yes.
Or sorry, she didn't realize her daughter Esther was alive, I should say.
Not dead,
Yeah, she thought Esther was dead. Who else? I mean, in an interesting way, John Jarndyce, which is the guardian of Esther, Ada, and Richard, is almost like an idealized father, but he's not really the father, and he can't really kind of replace the father for them. And what else?
Well, I hear what you're saying in terms of parents, but I have to go back to, we have, for example, Mrs. Jelly is the first person that we meet because Ada and Richard go on their journey to see Mr. Jarndyce before they've met him, to go to Bleak House. They stop at this house, and Mrs. Jellyby is so consumed with basically Africa, doing some things there for charitable work there. And she works night and day. She really shows no concern for her children whatsoever. And as a result, she has these sort of ridiculously unkempt and neglected children. But what's so interesting to me is Mr. Jellyby. We can go back and try to figure out what Charles Dickens thinks. But at the end of the day, we have a working mother, and she is the one who is consistently shamed throughout this book as being the one who not only does not take care of her children and worries about places other than what's right at home. And you can really tell that that's what Charles Dickens thinks, because he puts those words in Esther's mouth is that, maybe she should focus a little less on outside the home and a little bit more on inside the home. But we never hear what the hell is Mr. Jellyby doing? Nobody says, oh, Mr. Jellyby, get your act together. Your wife is working.
But again, that's the time. I mean,
well, I know. But if we consider that, we have nothing to discuss. So that's what I'm saying. So you have, what's interesting is you have this man. Let me just finish. You have this man who we kind of let off the hook, and then you have somebody like the Mrs. Pardiggle, who is sort of the Victorian version of a tiger mom. And she has her children, and she makes sure that they do everything that children ought to do. This one can do this one can do that. And they give their money to the poor, and they don't want to do any of it. They're just sullen, angry kids because their mom's so obsessed with making sure they look good. So we have that criticism. So you really, as a mother, I guess, in this book, cannot win. This is me as a mom.
Well, there's Mrs. Bagnet.
Mrs. Bagnet is saintly. You have,
which one is Mrs. Bagnet again?
Mrs. Bagnet is George's friend. George is the son of Mrs. Roundswell, who's the housekeeper. And Mr. and Mrs. Bagnet, they just basically go on and on about Mrs. Bagnet being this wonderful woman. But you can't say too much because discipline must be maintained is sort of the refrain of his. So she is held up as a sort of model character, as is Esther Summerson. And all of these women who are held up as model citizens are ones who don't aspire to too much more than their duty inside the home. And that's the part where I don't know if that's truly what Charles Dickens thinks, because he has made some comments about things in the story where the women seem to be more intelligent. If you'll notice, Mr. Bagnet always defers to Mrs. Bagnet. Tell them what I think, which really means tell me what I think, because I don't know what I think until you say it. So it's interesting, and I just wonder what you think he really believes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that there's an element of not wanting, of being a little bit fearful, maybe, about women kind of venturing too far from the domestic sphere. I think with the idea that men wouldn't really be good at it, and that if women move away from the domestic sphere, it's just not going to be handled. It is curious that he doesn't seem to criticize Mr. Jellyby, though I think that part of Mr. Jellyby's problem is that he has a sort of learned helplessness in connection with his wife, that he doesn't even bother to kind of take charge and be Mr. Mom. I think that, the one bit of pro-feminist sentiment in the book is that is the story of the bricklayers' wives who I forget the exact chain of events, but Esther and Ada kind of, while wandering off in the town where Bleak House is, they
I think that's
come
when
across
Mrs. Pardiggle takes them there in the beginning.
Right. Thanks. So that basically they kind of go to the cottage of a poor family, and they meet these two couples live there. They have each has a child, and one of their children dies or is dead when they show up. You can tell that the bricklayers beat their wives, and it's like, how exactly are you going to solve this problem unless women are working outside of the home, Dickens? I mean, it's actually curious because he had a sort of experiment where he ran a charitable organization that helped women kind of get back on their feet. I'm not sure if it was particularly for women who had been beaten or just kind of more generally.
Really?
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because throughout the book, I mean, really, when you look at it, yeah, he's saying these things, but all of the characters who really have any good sense and can really handle things are women. Sir Lester Deadlock is kind of a nincompoop, right? Lady Deadlock is much more street smart.
Wait. But there's I think we're missing a very important thing about that. I think is the overriding metaphor about women at that time. And I think it has to do with Lady Deadlock and the fact that she dies as a result of the imminent discovery of what she had done by having a child out of wedlock. I think that was, to me, again, back to Dickens, which I think is a huge social commentary, this book. I think that the fact that she dies of her own hand, I can't remember exactly.
She basically died of she went out into the cold for too long, died because she felt so bad about shaming her family.
So, essentially of her own hand. And because of the imminent discovery by her husband of what she had done. And so to me, that says a lot about everything that you see in terms of women in this book. I think that's the large metaphor, the large social commentary metaphor.
What is it saying, though?
No, I'm saying the fact that this woman's husband, Lester Deadlock, Sir Lester, whatever, was about to discover, theoretically, that his wife had a baby before she was married. Oh my God, right? And that was going to, as far as she understood, as a woman, having been raised as a woman in this, society at this time, that would bring horrible, disgrace upon the Deadlock family. And she ended up killing herself as a result. To me, that is a major metaphor regarding how the role of the women or the position of women at that time. And in this book, it says a lot.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
This out, or a man is going to find this out. There's going to be a discovery.
Right. So doesn't that make you wonder, how to bring this to light in the way that he did? I feel as though it's like, how can we really say that Charles Dickens was a misogynist in any way? Because I think that's a lot of what people say. And I think the fact that he's bringing to light these very issues is quite interesting. I think that he was much more progressive in his thought. And it's difficult for me to say. I mean, I think there are a couple of hints. There's one point in which somebody says, and I could never find it, the problems that I have, and I feel like it was Judy Smallweed, but the problems that I have are basically men getting in my way, creating my problems. So he says, puts that in the character's mouth. And then at the end, Mrs. Jellyby, has given up the whole Africa project. And now she's hoping for women in Parliament, and I thought, why did he say that? Why women in Parliament? And why did he point out that this woman, Lady Deadlock, who we can, I think, reliably say is in the social circles, but is not of them, in the sense that she is more street savvy. She's had a life before this. She's much more emotionally and socially intelligent than those people around her who are named Doodle and Foodle and Coodle and all these funny names that are really kind of making fun of them. And I think she knows exactly where her place is and why she's in that place and what it takes to stay and be there. In other words, I think she's At times she's made out to be like just one of the elite class, which her, you know, it talks of the servants handling them in such a way. Dickens really talks about how all these people know exactly just how to manipulate their owners, I guess you want to, if you want to be crude about it. But
Right.
at the same time, she's one of the more self-aware characters. And presumably because she doesn't come from royal, not royalty, but, this sort of noble
Right.
life. She's had a couple rounds of going around the block, and she's just a different character. She's the smarter character in that way. And I think the fact that he points that out is interesting.
You mean points that out about her, despite the fact that upon the discovery of her, behavior, she kills herself.
I think that she has a great love and respect for Lester Deadlock, who proves himself to be a good man. And I think so much of the story is about being a sort of victim of the time, a victim of social constraints and social class struggles. And like Joe is such an example of just, the child just really being a victim of the circumstances that are, I think what he would say is the government, society at large, not individuals so much as society at large. And I think he says a lot of this, the same kind of thing about the law. And I think it's interesting. We have two lawyers here. I would like to know, as you were reading this, for example, Hortense, whatever her name is, she was never Mirandized, but they were very clear, Mr. Bucket was very clear, like, please don't say anything else. This could be used against you. Please do not parlay anymore. And I thought, when did Mirandizing become required? And then we have the horrible Mr. Bowles. When did it become illegal we still have ambulance chasers for certain, but did it ever become illegal to be that deceitful in the position of being a lawyer? Is there something now that protects?
Have you ever heard of Rudy Giuliani?
Exactly. So did you think anything had changed over time since you reading this?
In a word, no. I don't think that things have changed significantly, perhaps in details. Certainly, there's no such thing as equity anymore, except in Delaware. The immediate impetus, for this book is the problems with the equity system in England at the time. Equity courts were a separate set of courts from the common law courts. How did they get two sets of courts in England? Well, basically, back in the day, they had a king, and the king go and tell people, go decide stuff for me because I can't do everything. And one set of people that he had decide stuff was, the common law courts. And one set of people that he had decide stuff was the chancellor, who was more of like a religious authority. And these two sets of courts, they began to be territorial and to develop their own arcane sets of rules and their own kind of sets of jurisdictions. The ultimate result was that even though equity was meant to address more issues of conscience, like family relations, how to distribute money from trusts of dead people, stuff like that, it began to be, the fact that it became so arcane, the discretion that you had as an equity judge was such an impetus to just, dragging things out. Whereas common law was kind of more clear cut. Around the time that this book came out, Parliament passed a bill that made major reforms to equity. It was kind of something that was in the air that he plucked out and tried to make a novel of. It didn't work out well for him, right? Like in terms of you're writing the satire and the thing that you're satirizing kind of, gets dealt with to some extent. But I don't think that makes the novel a failure. I think that the equity system is kind of taken as more of a symbol for kind of wider problems of England just completely kind of failing to reform itself in a situation of massive social change. This is quite simply the single greatest social change since the advent of agriculture, some 5,000 or 10,000 years earlier. This is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution is ramping up, and this is really the first place that it's happening. Society is completely being changed. At the same time, the world is becoming more democratic. It doesn't matter anymore that you're part of an aristocracy. It did before, because the aristocracy was essentially a bunch of warlords who were keeping everyone in check and down on the farm doing work, right? That doesn't matter anymore. People can work in factories. People can start factories. People can, all sorts of opportunities were upending social relations.
But there was one thing that was still happening, and it's still happening today in America and England. The lawyers are taking all the money.
Yeah, that's fair to say. Right. Okay. So this is his major criticism of equity. To get to the point is that lawyers, I guess in the way that the equity system worked is that they could, basically get paid on the estate. So what happens in the novel is that there's this huge kind of equity case of where I guess they're trying to distribute the estate of a dead guy from way back when. He died a very long time ago. And somehow or other, there are just so many issues and they're so complex that the case just keeps on going on and on and on and on. As a result, you have whole armies of lawyers representing any number of people who could possibly benefit from this estate. And all those lawyers are being paid. And I think part of what happens is even if people don't want to participate, they become involuntary parties. This is maybe a little bit like Federal Rule Civil Procedure 19. But, all the funds of this huge estate are drawn down for just to pay all these lawyers as time goes on. And eventually the case goes away only because the estate is completely empty of money. And the closest equivalent I've seen to this is with litigation defense insurance policies, where I have seen instances where I'm not the lawyer responsible for this kind of thing. But I've certainly seen instances where lawyers will spend $150 million just defending, say, a major securities fraud case, thus depleting the D&O policy. It's remarkable how the hell that happens. And to the point where you can't settle because you can't pay a settlement because the lawyers have already
have the money.
Have already taken all the money. So.
I have to say one thing, just as it go back to the novel, that was a little bit confusing. I felt that that's what happened as well, that it just was reduced and it really ended because there was no money left. But there's also the sort of 11th hour, final will that was found at Crook's place after he died that was like later than all the other ones. And it's like, what's the point of introducing that one? Was it that there was, because it seemed as though that was an ending too. Did you guys... What happened there? What did you think that was?
It seemed to me that the finding of that particular will, the will was, as I recall, written. Maybe it was written earlier than the one that was being.
It was the latest one.
Later.
It was the later
one.
Just think about it this way: you're giving instructions to future people when you're dead. And you say, I want to give my money to my son Harry, not my daughter Jessica. And then later on, you're like, oh no, actually I love Jessica. Yeah, you change your mind. You're like, I'm going to give all my money to Jessica, not to Harry. And the later intention is trumps the earlier intention. It's just ironic, right? I mean, it's like, if we finally resolved it, and now, but it doesn't matter because all the money's gone.
All the money's gone.
And
I mean, that's that. But to be honest, that's just sort of a technical fuck up. What is more sort of devastating and on a human level is what it did to Richard.
Right.
Remember Richard?
Richard is such an interesting character because I don't know if we're supposed to admire him or feel sorry for him as the other characters in the novel do, but I certainly read it and I thought, how about some personal fucking responsibility? Like, why are we feeling so bad for this guy as though he's just being taken in and consumed by this case? And poor Richard, and he has a choice. Everyone has a choice.
Well, he does. And he made about 10 different choices. He was going to be a lawyer, and he was going to be a doctor, and he was going to go to the army, right?
He feels like the perfect example of trust fund babies, like he's just felt like one of those people where it's like, I have way too many options. And it's not even just trust fund babies in that it's their own issue. It's the idea of not allowing someone to make their own way ever in life. And you get the sense that he and Ada have been groomed in a way that Esther was not, in terms of like what to expect from their lives. It's just assumed that Esther is going to be a maid. And while we're reading the story, I don't know if anybody else was reading it and just thinking, what the fuck, man? Why is everybody so like, yeah, man, Esther's going to have the keys and be the maid. And we're going to be like, what? I don't know, nothing. We're going to go have like these other kinds of lives. And that class difference and why that happened is beyond me, and like why she has to be this.
There was sort of this undercurrent idea that Ada and Richard were just going to get all this money.
Exactly.
Right?
And
they were like hypothetical trust fund babies, right? Like
they were hypothetical trust fund babies, but they weren't like, we kind of knew, I think everybody kind of knew that they weren't going to get this money, but because of their birth, basically, is the sort of the message. They are worthy of going out into the world and having a certain type of job. They are of a certain class. Whereas Esther Summerson, because she is the shame of her mother and comes from this illegitimate upbringing, she just should be happy with whatever comes her way. And as a dutiful, person in this story, she is. She is just to the very bitter end. I should just only be so blessed. Like, meanwhile, she does have her happy ending and she is happy. And I think we were given that. And I'm so glad of that. But at the same time, the martyrdom of, just constantly her face is marred and, all these bad things happen to her. And she's just so happy for every little blessing that comes her way. Her little sad dog.
Some people have found her very boring. I've read.
I found her to be a little bit ridiculous.
I actually like her. I really identify with her.
I like her
I should
too.
say that I really identify with the way that I don't know. I think she was abused as a child. Not that my parents abused me, but I would say that my peers abused me.
Everybody's peers abuses them.
And my general, result in my psychology is to sort of be like, oh, I don't ever like deserve anything. And I find that very affecting. I mean, I think that she has very serious character flaw, which is that she is not assertive enough. And this is something that is subtly implied by Dickens. It's not until the very end of the novel, when it practically doesn't matter, that she finally tells off Skimpole. And even when she tells off Skimpole, the fraudster, who's like leeching off Jarndyce and Richard, even when she tells him off, like, she can't respond effectively when he gives her another set of bullshit responses. I don't think that Dickens is like approving of her psychological mindset, which is basically a defense mechanism. I think Dickens is depicting it as a defense mechanism against all the kind of pain that she experienced and the feeling that if she has the fear of her hopes being crushed, in the way that it's kind of like a way of avoiding pain, basically. So I think seen in that light, she's more sympathetic and interesting of a character.
Well, and I appreciate that she goes through that, and I appreciate that is a response. But I couldn't help but feel as though we as readers were kind of manipulated into feeling for her, and maybe not, that's not even a good word. Basically, we as readers like her because she is who she is and the way that she responds. Whereas I just want to say something else, which is what if she didn't respond in that way? There are other characters in this story who are somewhat of a foil to her, who have equally horrific lives, and they respond very differently, and yet we don't like them. So for example, maybe not Jenny, but Jenny's husband, or I mean, it's very hard to find one exactly that matches, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that if she responded a different way, we wouldn't like her character, and I think that's unfair because
I think
she just has this meek and wonderful response to everything, and so of course we think she's wonderful. But she should, like, if she were angry and bitter, that's a coping mechanism.
Well, I think the fact that at the beginning of the novel, you see or you read about her godmother, her guardian, and how nasty she was to her, So I think that just sets up for you, the reader, how you're going to respond to her as time goes on. Even if she was being bitchy, you'd probably say, well, I don't blame her. She was treated like shit when she was a kid.
I think Dickens almost wants her to be more of a bitch. I mean, I honestly think that. I think that it would have been better if she would have been blunt to John, like, get Richard the hell away from Skimpole, right?
Yeah, and get your head out of your ass because Mr. Skimpole is a leech. Yeah, totally. But
obviously Dickens has a lot of orphans in his fiction, and it's worth bringing up in this connection that he had a weird childhood where he wasn't really orphaned, but he sort of quasi-orphaned because his dad was sent to debtor's prison and he had to go work in a factory when he was 11, and it was shitty and awful, and as a result he has this weird obsessive interest in depicting orphans. Esther is one of them, Oliver Twist being the most famous, but Esther is one of them. To my mind, it's a pretty good it's a pretty damn good depiction of the psychology of an adoptee or an orphan. It's the kind of the wondering, the almost obsessive wondering over your parentage. In a way, like, this is also something that she represses. She kind of wonders about it, and at the same time, she tries not to think about it. There's an incredible passage. Let me just read it. I love this passage. It's when she is trying to find her mother, but she doesn't realize. She's so at the end, and the point that I have in bringing up this passage is that there's something deeply psychological going on with her, in her desire to see her mother and to kind of connect with, not just to know who her mother is, but to connect with her mother and to just kind of have a normal life. This is actually like a major spoiler of the book, but towards the end, the mother is running away because she thinks that her horrible secret of having a out of wedlock kid has been revealed, and to throw off the scent of the people trying to find her, she pays a poor woman, Jenny, to dress in her clothes and go like the opposite direction to which she's going, while Lady Deadlock dresses up in the clothes of the poor woman and goes back to London and goes back to the grave of the man with whom she was going to marry and was the father of Esther. Implying, kind of like her true love from back in the day. In any event, we don't know any of that at this point in the narrative that I'm about to read, but that's basically the context. And here's the paragraph. I love this paragraph. She is running towards this woman by who I think she thinks is Jenny or something. She thinks that it's the poor woman. This
is actually prior to when we discover that they've done that. So she doesn't think it's Jenny. Yeah. She just thinks it's some other poor woman who's gone missing.
Yeah, who might have a clue to where the mother is.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Okay, here's the paragraph. I have the most confused impressions of that walk. I recollect that it was neither night nor day, that morning was dawning, but the street lamps were not yet out, that the sleet was still falling, and that all the ways were deep with it. I recollect few chilled people passing in the streets. I recollect the wet housetops, the clogged and bursting gutters and waterspouts, the mounds of blackened ice and snow over which we passed, the narrowness of the courts by which we went. At the same time, I remember that the poor girl seemed to be yet telling her story audibly and plainly in my hearing, that I could feel her resting on my arm, that the stained house fronts put on human shapes and looked at me, that great water gates seemed to be opening and closing in my head or in the air, and that the unreal things were more substantial than the real.
Okay, so that's actually different than what I thought you were going to read. So
I think I remember that.
tell me about why do you like that?
It's because she's in this, she's exhausted. You know, in the next chapter, it turns out she's sick. And I think she got, she's basically, she went on this marathon search with this detective Bucket to find her mother.
Yeah.
She is exhausted. She's been up all night. She's probably really sick. It's incredibly cold. It's like wet.
Right.
And I think she's in a state of mind where she's just like in a phantasmagoria, right? And she is, it's just such an incredible, psychological evocation. And particularly that great water gates seem to be opening and closing in my head or in the air, and that the unreal things were more substantial than the real. And this, and it's just, I think Dickens, really cares about the sort of basics of a life, of having good parents, of, raising your children well, of having, decent, honest work. These kind of very basic things. And this is sort of what, one of those major things was what was denied to Esther. And it's hers, in what we see here is some sort of emotional kind of floodgates of, really like desiring to have a mother kind of opening up or have a real parent. She didn't have any parent, right? And which makes, it's just like it's like a child, like a lost child, I find that really a powerful moment. Anyway, go on.
I just wanted to write this, to read this commentary that I got from, I guess it's literariness.org, that made this. This guy wrote about Esther, since you're discussing her. He said Esther's style and language still have many characteristic Dickensian traits, but many readers have nonetheless found her a tiresome bore. Esther is too passive, too deferential to others, too repressed, too coy. She conceals or withholds her feelings about her mother and about Woodcourt, and she dutifully accepts the role of the little woman, period. Commentators disagree on whether Dickens was celebrating Esther as a feminine ideal or using her to show the oppressiveness of the patriarchal institution. I tend to think it was the last part.
I think that's a perfect summation of my question. And what you just said, Daniel, about this, it's easy to miss those kinds of passages in the story. And I think what it makes Esther is a much more three-dimensional character in the sense that when you imagine what she had to go through, or what she went through as a child, to have that constant narrative in your head of like, your existence is a problem and what you have to shut down emotionally in order to survive that. She's a real hero in that psychological sense, in that her coping mechanism is so much more difficult than we imagine that it is. We just think that she's just we imagine that it's not incredibly, incredibly difficult to shut down those parts of yourselves that have your own wants and needs and desires. I think in almost every human being, to be able to put that off to the side is a near impossibility. And what is interesting is that there's a character like Caddy, who in a sense, has no mother. She's just a very neglected child. But in that way, even the worst mother is better than no mother at all. And I think that's kind of the takeaway message when you compare the two characters of Caddy
and Esther.
Because in some ways, like Caddy definitely, she has that fighting spirit, right? Of just bitterness. And she has a mother to project her anger onto. And when you don't have that, it's very different because you then have to turn it inward, right? Like, I don't know. But I just feel like there is something to be said about even the most terrible mother. Caddy had a place to put that anger. She had a person that she could blame. it was definitely left marks and it definitely left wounds. And I won't say that it didn't, because then we see her go into a somewhat unhealthy relationship with the Turvey drops. It's the best we can hope for her, and I think it's fine. I don't think it's ultimately super tragic. But when you compare those two characters, that's what sticks out the most for me, is that she had a terrible life with a mother. And in some ways you think, oh, well, okay, yeah, that's pretty awful. But like what Caddy has, the little spunk that's inside her that's fighting back, like that died in Esther a very long time ago. And it's not until the very end of the novel that we see a hint of massive amounts of good fortune and love that brought it back for her.
Right. Very a glimmer. Yeah. What do you call it? The disease as a metaphor. The disease, obviously, that Joe ends up giving to Esther. Smallpox. Yeah. Which I know Queen Elizabeth got herself as well. It was all over the place. But I'm just wondering, because some theorists have posed that the disease is a metaphor for some things that Dickens is saying in this book, which you can see when you think about the way he treats the environment and everything else that's going on. He really is making a very harsh judgment on the society. But I'm wondering what you guys thought about it.
There's an idea of literal pollution that makes you sick, and there's an idea of spiritual pollution that I think he's alluding to. Somehow he's alluding to religious pollution as well, or spiritual pollution.
Well, I think it's interesting when you say that, you remind me of the idea of Tom All Alone's being so close to Chancery Court and everything being so close together, and yet I think it was not Mr. Bucket, because he would have been very well aware. I'm not sure who was walking through at one point in the story, and they were just so taken aback by the poverty that existed right amongst them.
Right.
And
we haven't talked about Joe at all at this point, right?
No, the little boy. Joe he's
very important.
I just think that he's such and I have to say, when you listen to the audiobook, I don't remember him from the miniseries, but he's so pitiful. His voice is so pitiful. He's the most pitiful thing that has ever been written. I haven't read Oliver Twist, so I'm certain that's that's along the same lines of really terrible sadness about what these kids had to go through and just how little care. And this is one child, and we really weep for his death and his life and his situation. And this is happening probably quite often, but we have this one character that we see.
Yeah, that's awful.
Well, the way that this connects to Joe is that what Dickens keeps on harping on about with pollution is that there's all these dead bodies just buried in London, and you have, the poor, living in horrible housing, and they're getting diseases. They have poor sanitation. They're getting diseases, and they're spreading out to other places. So there's a way that the sin of inequality is causing literal disease.
Yeah. Except that Esther gets it. Except that the kid gives it to Esther, and Esther could have given it to somebody else in the family, but she didn't, because they got out of everyone stayed away from her.
So they all got it from each other. I mean, ultimately they passed it along to one another, and it was her connection with Joe, and then Charlie's connection with Joe, and then her connection with Charlie that ultimately gave her this disease. But there's a lot of I think one of the messages that I took home from this was that inequality affects everyone. When you don't allow the poorest of the poor to have access to, running water and education and all of these kinds of things, it behooves you as an upper class to be concerned about these issues, because it could get on you, so to speak. I think
it does.
And it does. And I think that's kind of the point, because if one of the biggest things about this book that you cannot help but notice is how at one point Mr. Smallweed is, actually speaking, I think, with Esther, and the point being these characters who are so far away from one another in station in life and in physical distance, but how they're so interconnected. Crook is connected to Codden, who's connected to Smallweed, who's connected to George, and all of these interconnections. And I think that's his point, we've got every class of person, and we're all connected in these ways that are so important. And that if we don't make...
Yeah, and the connection can actually be that you catch a disease from somebody who's poor.
Exactly. So it behooves us as a society to be more concerned about those things that we think are so far away from us. But they aren't. Exactly. They're just around the corner. And it's really important that, everybody gets a step up in life. And I think that was probably part of his larger message. And I think he does a good job at illustrating how we are all connected.
Just to give a quick programming note, at this point we had to take a break, but we reconvened a few days later to finish the discussion.
I was reading up on his early life a little. He was really considered a social critic as well as, a writer. Apparently, he did not like women.
I don't know how you could possibly gather that. I'm gonna have to challenge. You're gonna have to show me the data. I read something completely opposite.
I don't mean to say he didn't like women, but it's arguable because apparently his mother was. There was a time when his father, was in jail for debt, in debtor's prison. And, he was like, fourth of 8 kids or second of 8, I don't know. The youngest kid and his wife went to jail with him, but Charles Dickens and his brothers, whatever, were farmed out to various people and places. But one of the things that had to happen is Charles Dickens had to stop going to school and had to work in this factory and earning 6 shillings a week or whatever, because he had to help support the family. But apparently, when the father got out of jail, out of debtor's prison, the mother apparently did not try to get Charles back. She's like, let him stay in the warehouse working for a little while. That's my understanding, right? I read about that. Yeah. And there's people, I've read through a couple of different things, and the people some theorists feel that contributed to, let's say, his questionable feelings about women.
I definitely have read here and there articles about him with regard to women, and I did not get that. I did not get that idea that he had something against women. He believed that women should be educated, and he married someone who was the kind of woman that, is respectable and intelligent. And so I don't know. I don't necessarily have that feeling.
On the question of whether he liked or didn't like women, I think the long and the short of it is that I think there's a line in the novel when he's describing Miss Partigal where he says something that suggests that his belief is that he thinks that the principal place of women is in the home. I think that that basically sums up his belief on the matter.
Dickens,
yeah,
you're saying?
That's my sense coming from the novel. And I don't agree with it, but I think the reality of it is that, Dickens really does have this 19th century view of, a woman's place is in the home. But at least my sense is that he thinks women are basically equal to men in their mental faculties. It's just sort of like a division of labor and possibly his views of the different, spiritual or emotional natures of men and women that, his argument would probably be that, women are more suited to this and men are more suited to that. That all of this stuff is just buried assumptions, I think, in the book. I don't think it's not really thematized in the book. It's not really his main point.
I don't think it's the most important,
Right. And I also think, if you look at it a little bit more charitably and you just say, he just thinks someone should be in the home. And at that time, the people who made money were men and the people who stayed home were women. And it was as a result of women were not as educated. Women were not hired. There were a lot of jobs that were physically more demanding, which were better suited to a male body. Not saying that women can't be strong and do hard work, but I'm just saying there's a bazillion things that go into why it's a man and a woman. And instead of seeing it as, how we view women, just maybe just seeing it as like how we view the home, and the idea that I actually subscribe to in a lot of ways, which is, it's great to go out and have all of your hopes and your dreams and your wishes. But I mean, somebody has to take care of kids. If you're going to have children, you have to actually take care of them. You have to put aside some of your own wants and needs and desires and dreams and hopes to a certain degree to be present for your children. And one could argue you can't have 20 of them and be present for all of them either. Like, those are my opinions. And so it's kind of one of those things where I feel like, okay, so in this day and age, how do we interpret this story? And I think it's very highly applicable because, right now, especially with the pandemic, it's interesting. Our society kind of broke down because some of the childcare structures that we've established, and because of that, men and women can both work,
right,
became, really, really obvious. It's like, oh, a school is not just a place for kids to go learn. School is a place that enables parents to go and pursue, their own goals and move society forward, and how that's interconnected. And I think that's an interesting thing about the story. And it's like you would throw the baby out with the bathwater if you just focused on the fact that it is women. But I will say, for example, with Mrs. Jellyby, a lot of these men who didn't actually have jobs, but they were just, I guess, endowed with some kind of money from their prior family members, why they weren't ever considered more involved, that was a real shame. And that is a real shame. Like, they have something to offer. And I think for the longest time, people didn't believe that men really could do those things. I mean, there are studies now that show that the secure attachment, like specific studies about attachment that show, actually a man can be the primary caregiver and the child can grow up with a secure attachment, even if they aren't able to nurse, and that feeding a child with a bottle is helpful in that. All these interesting studies that hurt.
Yeah, but that obviously wasn't at play in the 1850s.
Exactly.
But the other thing that I wanted to point out is, or mention, is that a lot of Dickens' concentrations were on orphanages and both children. But if we look at it metaphorically in a bigger sense, not having that kind of guardian care, you know what I mean? And I think that even though he came from a family of a mother and a father, like 6 or 7 brothers and sisters, that was a big focus for him. And I think that that's because, like I say, metaphorically, he never really experienced that kind of connection, that kind of love, that kind of support that you hope to give to your children, or you hope to get from your parents. And I think that was why he focused on that so much, children who are lost. Plus, if you look at the concept of Bleak House, really, that's talking about all of England at that time. I mean, just look at that country, look at particularly London, what it was going through. So it's just fascinating. Maybe it's part of his social critic self, but that he focused on that, I mean, personally, I didn't know much about his early life, and I thought, oh, he must have been an orphan.
You're making me think about the structure, too, of the novel. It's like, normally when people write novels, especially the way that we read them now, you write the whole thing. And if you write the whole thing and something in your first chapter doesn't really pan out, you can go back and you can edit and you can get rid of that character. But because he wrote it the way that he did in this serialized fashion, I'm curious if I don't think that he had the entire thing laid out before he ever started. I think he wrote the first 4 chapters, and then it was like, all right, let's go from there. And then he had the next 4. And he wrote those, and then those were published. Maybe. So people had these characters. So it has this, it has the qualities of Bleak House. It's like this rambling novel. It's like a rambling house where, you feel like there were additions and add-ons and, whatever, like all these different renovations and changes. And one person shows up here and never shows up again. It's not really concise and efficient in that way, but it's so good because of that. Like, this is the kind of book where, once you really get into it, and after you've, like, for me, I've heard it on audio, I'm like, oh, this is just such a luxurious novel. It just takes its time with everything it wants to describe. I mean, he goes off on these tangents with characters about.
Well, I think you're right. The fact that he did it in a serial structure initially, that lent itself to that.
Yeah. It's very interesting to read it, knowing that it kind of, he definitely had the plot in mind, right, before he wrote it. I'm certain of that. The main characters, the the Deadlocks.
Oh, yeah.
There's definitely foreshadowing. So I think he must have had the big idea in the beginning, but to span this over, 1,000 pages, over, I don't know, wonder how long it took to get this out. And the idea being too, that these people who read this, you sit with the characters in the first 4 chapters for a long time, and maybe you read it more than once because you can't wait for the next one. So it must have been much easier to keep up with reading it that way as well.
Yeah.
You talked about orphans. Joe, is obviously the most predominant character orphan in this book, and he just keeps saying, "I didn't know nothing. I don't know nothing. I don't know anything. There's nothing that I know." Like that sentence is repeated over and over and over. It kind of makes you think, okay, he's trying to let us know that we should have a kind of education system so that this person has a means by which they can get out of the mess that they are in.
Right. It's not only that, it's when Joe dies, the critical thing that's happening at the time is that I believe John Jarndyce is teaching him the Our Father, which is a prayer he had never been taught. And this is something that Dickens touches on a number of times when speaking about Joe, that he knows nothing of religion. He knows nothing of really any of the things that people are taught to kind of humanize them. And I think there's some idea of sort of a natural impulse in Joe. But, Dickens is not a romantic in this book. He's some sort of, he's very much influenced by romanticism, but he also recognizes the criticisms of it as well. He doesn't, view Joe in any sort of idealized way.
He puts in Joe's mouth towards the end when he's talking about religion, something along the lines of, I never knew nothing about religion or prayers or anything. And he says, I overheard it a few times when people would do it, but it never really seemed like they were talking to anybody. It seemed something like they were just sort of saying it out loud to themselves, or it's something in the way that he describes that. And I have no idea where it is in the book, but it's in that area where you get the idea that the people who have religion, and he puts this in the character also, Mr. what's his name? The guy that is the religious guy that always, he's always so religious, but he never really.
The Snagsby's pastor.
The Snagsby's pastor.
Right.
He's criticizing people who represent religion. He does it with Miss Pardiggle. He gives this religious book, and this guy's like, I can't even read. Like, I wouldn't read it anyway. It's a baby book. It's like, it's not for real people. And I think his criticism is that religion is pious in this way, and it's way too interested in its own merits, and it really isn't interested in like serving the underserved. So it's more of a virtue signaling, I guess you would call it.
Yeah, that's exactly the word I had in mind too.
So he's being very critical of religion in that way, and I don't think he's saying religion is bad. I think he's saying the way that people practice religion is extremely unhelpful to people who need it the most.
Absolutely.
And I think this connects to kind of broader criticism, or the broader kind of thematics of the book, in that Dickens sometimes kind of pans away to a kind of a bird's eye view of London, or a panoramic view of London. And one of the times he does this is in connection with this issue we're talking about now. The passage is Joe sitting on the street. Here's the quote. There he sits, i.e. Joe, munching and gnawing and looking up at the great cross on the summit of St. Paul's Cathedral, glittering above, a red and violet-tinted cloud of smoke. From the boy's face, one might suppose that sacred emblem to be, in his eyes, the crowning confusion of this great confused city, so golden, so high up, so far out of reach. There he sits, the sun going down, the river running fast, the crowd flowing by him in 2 streams, everything moving on to some purpose and to one end, until he is stirred up and told to move on to. This connects in my mind to the beginning of the novel, which I won't read as well, but has the just incredibly famous passage of the London fog and mire, which is a metaphor for kind of the state of England generally. And this later image of Joe sitting there and everything being unintelligible to him, he's kind of like the instantiation of what Dickens was talking about earlier, of a world of just pure kind of a fog world. And it's a sort of, and I think this is sort of like a critical kind of thing in the novel, that kind of fog is essential to the book. Like in the first 300 pages, you have what appear to be 5 different, more or less disconnected novels, and no clear sight of what the plot's going to be, except for some foreshadowing, which makes it very difficult in my mind to read at first, and which makes it kind of critical to try to put the pieces together as you go along. Actually, it's almost like you're forced to become a sociologist yourself. That's kind of what if you were to really play the game that the novel is trying to set up and not rely on Wikipedia and in the movie, which is what I
right,
guilty. That's what that's what you would have to be doing, I think.
In other words, the reader works a little more.
Yeah, the reader.
So in that line, I would like to bring up ghosts, and just like, what can somebody please help me out with the ghosts? Because there's ghosts and there's birds quite a bit in this novel, and I just feel like I fully admit to my limitations as a reader, and I don't really. Is it a sign of the times? People just need a good ghost story, but he brings up ghosts so much in his novels, all of them. There's always this sort of spooky, eerie. Like, did you guys ever read Great Expectations? And then there's A Christmas Carol. What is his point here when he does this, especially the Lady Deadlock thing with the walking footsteps, the ghost
walk?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the ghosts, okay, like in Christmas, there's Christmas Carol. The ghosts are very much sort of, it's like the ghost of conscience, right?
Yeah.
Here, I guess, is a ghost is kind of like a ghost of conscience here. Maybe. Actually, so with regards to the ghost, I think that this is a good time to bring up my belief that Dickens has an implicit kind of moral view, that it's almost sort of a kind of like Humean or Rousseauian way of kind of morals being based on the emotion, and that this is partially why he's such a sentiment, that he plays on the emotions so much, that he really feels like there's no way to really know what morality is except through the emotions.
Side note, it's chapter 7, and it says, on the night before a famous battle, Sir Morbury caught his wife in the stables, attempting to lame his horse, which he would ride into battle the next day. He managed to stop her, but the horse kicked her, and she walked with a limp for the rest of her days. She never recovered from this injury, but she took on walking to the terrace, brooding silently over her fate. One day, her husband saw her collapse on the terrace and tried to carry her inside. She refused his aid, however, and before she died, promised that she would walk the terrace until the Deadlock line was punished. So it says Sir Morbury's wife tries to sabotage her husband's ability to find and therefore weaken the royalist forces. So the story of the Ghost's Walk foreshadows Lady Deadlock's eventual downfall. When I read that, I don't remember, when I read it, I didn't get all that. Like, I didn't receive that she was trying. I was like, why is she going to the horses? Why does she care? So that part I think was a little bit confused about, and just in the sense of like, why would she want to do that?
What time period was she from? I forget what it was. Because Mr. Or Sir Deadlock.
The English Civil War. Okay, so it says here, during the English Civil War, when Parliament Parliament rebels overthrew Charles I, Sir Morbury Deadlock married a woman whose brother joined the revolution against the crown. The lady's brother was killed during the skirmish, and after this, she swore revenge on the Deadlock family. I guess the point would be that we have this woman who. So we have the royalty, like the old way, the crown, and all of that, versus sort of the new, more democratic way. And
this was Milton. This was Milton's time, right? And they basically killed their king
So like 1400s, are you talking about?
No. This would be around 1650. So it's like the Protestant Catholic Wars of Religion.
The Reformation. Okay.
But actually, I shouldn't say not the Protestant, but I mean it's like around the time of Reformation. But this particular dispute, it's kind of larger than religion, although religion is. But
oh right, 16. Okay.
But so an interesting thing about here is that, as we all know, about 1848 there was a convulsion of revolutions in Europe, but England, didn't have a revolution. But I think that one of the things that is a subtext of the book is sort of trying to address how to I think something to keep in mind here is that the world that is being described here is kind of a bit of a powder keg, which is why Sir Deadlock is going on about Wat Tyler all the time, which is the more of the revolutionary from Chaucer's time, who was leading the peasants' revolt. So we're talking about the book brings up Wat Tyler, the book brings up the people who killed Charles I. All these kind of past revolutions are sort of it's the exact same metaphor that Marx used, right? As a specter is haunting Europe, right?
So what's interesting is that like she dies, this woman dies, this whatever her name is, Morbury woman, right? And then Lady Deadlock dies. So
right.
in this novel, it's like, okay, so what's he trying to say then? I mean, I don't know exactly the government situation at that time, but is he trying to say that Parliament wins, like that the government wins and that, royalty wins? Because it isn't as though the people who are not royalists, because I think, Sir Deadlock represents the royalists, and as did that Lord Morbury or whatever. And then
right.
the women, particularly the first woman, I don't know her name. I'm going to just call her Lady Morbury because I have no idea. But the woman who died on the ghost walk, she was pissed about her brother. So she clearly represents the people who were overthrowing, and they don't make it through. Like they're not triumphant. And in fact, he really paints Sir Leicester Deadlock as just kind of a very noble character. So I don't know. I guess I'm just trying to say, like, what was his point? Does he have a point even?
He had to, because he was a social critic as well as a novelist, Dickens. So, I mean, I'm sure there was a point.
Sorry, what is the question?
I just think, it seems as though there's a lot of criticism of the old ways of thinking, the royalty, the difference in class structure, and how that's kind of going out the window, right? I mean, that's a big overarching message. But then in this particular storyline, you have a character who represents the non-noble, the not royalists, whatever you would call it, the commoners. That woman dies, and then Lady Deadlock dies, and in fact, the royal guy, the noble guy, Sir Leicester Deadlock, is painted in. I mean, he is a bit of a schmuck and a buffoon, but he's actually painted as a very good, upstanding guy in the end, in my opinion. So
yeah, but Lady Deadlock dies for a very specific reason. I mean,
right. I mean, that's true, but it doesn't seem as though. I guess maybe Esther is the new generation, and she kind of is like they fought, they died for you, but and
right.
Maybe Esther is kind of like the representation, because you also have Mr. Roundswell, who actually does fairly well for himself, if I remember correctly in the novel, of his own doing. Like he ended up having saved quite a bit of money, and like George doesn't want it. Remember that whole storyline? So he's sort of the commoner that kind of created his own fortune. And then there's Esther, who, although she suffered in the same way that Lady Deadlock suffered, in terms of socially, her class is going to be limited by her past and her what her history is, whereas Esther doesn't have that same.
Yeah,
she's not held back in that same way. So maybe that's his point. Is that
like
generations
but
forward?
I mean, it's possible, but I mean, the thing about Esther is that she's an orphan of the highest caliber. I mean, if you think about it, right? completely.
Yeah, and the only reason that she was really able to get married is because it turns out, what was his name? Woodcourt. Mrs. Woodcourt's like, oh, you're related to her. Okay, so I like you now. Now you can
right. Exactly. Yeah. No, absolutely.
I have one observation to make on Sir Lester Deadlock. An interesting arc that he has is that he, the critical moment when he's shown to accept the fact that his wife had this out of wedlock child. Dickens has a paragraph explaining or commenting on the situation, describing his reaction, and here it is. His, i.e., Sir Lester Deadlock's formal array of words might have at any other time, as it often had, something ludicrous in it, but at this time it is serious and affecting, right? His stuffy way of talking. His noble earnestness, his fidelity, his gallant shielding of her, his generous conquest of his own wrong and his own pride for her sake are simply honorable, manly, and true. Nothing less worthy can be seen through the luster of such qualities in the commonest mechanic. Nothing less worthy can be seen in the best born gentleman. In such a light both aspire alike, both rise alike, both children of the dust shine equally. And what you have there is a really obvious illustration of Dickens' sort of Christian egalitarianism. This connects also with George, the soldier who is kind of like the runaway child of the Deadlock's housekeeper, Mrs. Roundswell. George, who goes off to fight in wars and gets estranged from his parents. And, he's initially accused of killing Tulkinghorn. John Jarndyce and Esther visit him and say, you got to get a lawyer. And his reaction is, it's like dishonorable. Like if the truth as I recount it can't stand on its own, I'll just have to be hanged. His point being that it's like lawyers in a way don't really care about the truth for the sake of the truth, right? They care about the truth in terms of how they can spin it. So he connects in a really kind of strong way with Sir Lester Deadlock and that, and honor. All three of them, both of them connect with the theme of honor. And, so in this critical passage, Dickens is basically saying about Sir Lester Deadlock that his acceptance of his wife is honorable. Dickens is implying that he cares so much about honor that he ultimately, it kind of screws him over. But that's how much he cares about honor. And, the law is dishonorable in contrast because it's not fundamentally concerned about the truth. And in the end, their arc is that they end up together, right? George comes back into the Deadlock household because he was already, to live with his mother, the housekeeper. And they have a sort of touching scene where Deadlock recognizes the son of the housekeeper, which is kind of remarkable, right? Because it's like it's probably something that at the time he didn't really even pay much attention to, but he must have, it's sort of like somewhere in the back of his mind, like I kind of recognize this guy from being the boy that used to be around the house, right? And it's sort of like they're both connecting. He's connecting with his basic human emotions, his basic kind of connections to other people at the end of the book. And in a way that, I think that this is very much connected to sort of Dickens' kind of fundamental moral message that people are kind of geared to have morals from their emotions. And that there's a million things in civilization. It's a Rousseauian thing, right? There's a million things in civilization that bring you away from that. But, as a fundamental task, we somehow have to figure out how to connect back with our fundamental moral intuitions in the same way that Deadlock did with reconnecting with his, fundamental desire to kind of have human connections, like, George, the kid of the housekeeper.
Roundswell.
Does that make sense? And it connects with honor in the sense that, honor is an aristocratic virtue, right?
Right.
It's about courage in battle and blah, blah, blah. And Dickens is kind of turning it around and making honor more about, caring about the truth and standing in direct,
or valuing it.
Right, like giving other people proper value, right? Giving his wife proper value over rumors.
Right.
George giving the truth proper value, right? It's like honor is about having the right stance in the world towards, the morally salient things.
Right. So, Mrs. Flight's birds were interesting to me, and I just wondered what your thoughts were. Like, what's the point of all the birds? Like, there's birds mentioned.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say.
There's a critical passage right towards the end that I thought was like the single best passage on the birds. Miss Flight and I think Esther talking. So this is Miss Flight speaking first. Another secret, my dear, I have added to my collection of birds. Really, Miss Flight? Said i.e. Esther, knowing how it pleased her to have her confidence received with an appearance of interest. She nodded several times, and her face became overcast and gloomy. 2 more. I call them the wards in Jarndyce. They are caged up with all the others, with hope, joy, youth, peace, rest, life, dust, ashes, waste, want, ruin, despair, madness, death, cunning, folly, words, wigs, rags, sheepskin, plunder, precedent, jargon, gammon, and spinach. The poor soul kissed me with the most troubled look I had ever seen in her, and went her way. Her manner of running over the names of her birds, as if she were afraid of hearing them, even from her own lips, quite chilled me. I think the birds are connect with this whole repression idea, right? They're, it's almost like Dickens was a Freudian before Freud, right?
Freud.
And actually, there's been a series of articles recently, which I've only glanced at, that kind of criticize the idea of trauma and how central the trauma narrative has become in our lives.
I just read that article. Yeah.
Oh, really? Yeah.
The one with the big T and the little t, and how we've overused the word trauma and it's lost its meaning.
Right. But, it's very much, we don't know Miss Flight's trauma. It's so far buried back that, but I think it's implied. I think, I don't know. To some extent, maybe it's like just the case is so awful that it, screwed her up. But I think in Richard's case and in Flight's case, there's some implication of maybe something else going on in the background. Because it's difficult to know exactly why Richard is so flighty himself, or why Miss Flight became so focused on getting a judgment in from the Chancery.
She says at one point, basically my mother before me or somebody before me, and now I've taken up the Jarndyce case, and he went mad or she went mad, and now she kind of knows that she's mad. And Esther says something, Esther, the voice of reason, says, don't you think it might be a good idea to stop doing what everyone before you who has gone mad doing has done? And now, and there's the certain level of madness in Richard that we see kind of being passed down.
Oh, yeah.
And as there was a kind of a feeling that emerged throughout reading this book of what happens to Richard is kind of a really universal feeling. And I don't know how to describe it except to say, what happens to people when they hold on to things well past when they should be held on to. And they just, they say, oh, I'll be happy when, it reminds me of it reminds me of people who hold their grudges in their families, and or like I have a family member who's going through a will right now, and it's like, well, I'm going to I'm going to not let this go, and I'm going to hang on because I am on the side of justice. And how that can actually end up being kind of damaging, because even if you're right, even if you've ever been sued, which I have, there's a point at which, the very beginning where you feel like, oh my gosh, this is completely unjust and I have to fight this. And then it becomes apparent that justice isn't the point. You have a certain amount of money that you're willing to spend, and you think, okay, am I going to get this by settling, or am I going to get this by continuing because I'm on the side of justice? And the only person who really loses is the person who loses the most money in that game, And so it's kind of the point being, you have to let some things go, and you have to just like say, all right, that may have been, I may have gotten all the millions of dollars, or I may be on the side of justice, or I may be right, but being right isn't serving me. So I just need to settle and give these people their money, and they can be on their way, and we can both go about our lives. But that injury of justice, some people can't let that go. And I think there's a lot of injustices in the story. And when you're talking about trauma, if you've ever gone to a therapist and gone through your history, there's a point at which you just have to say, you know what, that did happen, but there is no justice to be found. I can't go back and change that. I can't yell at this person. That. I can't fix that. I have to move on, and I can't let it consume me.
Yeah.
And I think Richard kind of represents, and Mrs. Flight, represents that idea for me, that idea of just not letting go of your past wounds to the point where you're the only person you're harming at this point is yourself. You have to try to move on.
This is really like the worst part of the Industrial Revolution, right? It's the part where Marx was writing the Communist Manifesto, and it really seemed like Marx could be right, because it just seemed like the rich got richer and the poor got poorer, and it wasn't a rising tide lifting all boats, which didn't happen until 1860, 1870, at least widespread in Europe, Western Europe. It was more what Marx had actually described. I mean, Dickens is very concerned about inequality here and the way that it affects personalities, right? With Sir Lester Deadlock, with Joe, with any number of different characters you could potentially look at it. And, when I think about it some more, Chancery is the thing that's being focused on here, and it drives people crazy. Because it's like, we had mentioned with Richard that it's almost like he's a hypothetical trust fund baby, right?
Baby.
Yeah, it's like, and that he knows that he's like a hair's breadth away at, falling into fortune not through work, but, through this case. And, that kind of desire to pursue that drives him nuts in a really kind of fundamental way.
I think what you said about the inequality, and then you bringing up Marx, makes me think, the thing about Marx that I vaguely remember or know about is that he kind of thought you should just get rid of class structure altogether. Like the differing classes is what created the animosity. And so that was always going to cause a problem. So like he just believed in this massive amount of equality, right, for everyone. And I think while Dickens is pointing out that inequality is a huge issue, and that even if you are of the upper noble class, that you need to concern yourselves with the lower classes, and you need to care about those people who are not where you are on the social ladder, because it will ultimately affect you. It's a very pragmatic reason. But what he seems to be saying in this story is not that we need equality. I think he points out very much that it is a fundamental part of human nature to strive to improve oneself and to get better and to socially. I think he really recognizes the idea of social recognition. and how people want to better themselves and want to be more than they are in this moment. Whereas I think Marx, I mean, I don't know, I really shouldn't be talking about Marx because I don't know very much about him, but I feel like what he kind of always seemed to say was that you need to squash that. You can't have different classes because that animosity will ultimately create war. And I think Dickens kind of says, yeah, we are going to always have class differences. That's never going to go away. But we need to make class differences a more meritocratic system where people have access to education and people have access to health, and it makes everybody better when the poorest of the poor are better, as the smallpox thing kind of illustrated.
I think that I would agree that Dickens is very skeptical of utopian scheme. You know, he comes out as a sort of critic of romanticism here with his treatment of Skimpole, his recognition of the way that you can use altruism to defraud people, basically. Jellyby is obviously very negatively portrayed here.
Yeah.
You know, I really, so I agree that on a practical level, you know, he might, you know, he'd probably keep capitalism, right? But I do think he's pointing towards some sort of third wayism, you know, from even back in the day. He clearly hates aristocracy. Like, he really
very
hates
worried
it.
about the poor.
I mean, he's, you know, very worried about the poor. He knows, you know, if I had to guess, this would be some sort of like, but he doesn't really fit into either of the political parties of the day. He's not quite a rah-rah liberal. I mean this in the 19th century sense of, would be like libertarian now, right? Which was the other, which was like more the Whigs at the time. He's not really a Tory because he doesn't really like aristocracy. I think he's kind of like basically gesturing towards what eventually became a center-left kind of, you know, position of, you know, Christian socialism or something like that. You know, so, you know, no, he wasn't Marx. He wasn't like trying to like destroy property as such, but he was very much he was trying to observe the ways that, you know, the property system really does kind of distort lives. The way that it, I mean, that critical passage at the end couldn't be clearer with Sir Leicester Deadlock, you know, basically saying that the best thing he could possibly do is the same thing as a common mechanic would do, you know, is to be honorable and to have proper relations with other people. And you know, and there has to be some sort of idea of a redistribution going on here, given Joe, given, you know, the description of squalid conditions, given, you know, the main romantic lead here is Woodcourt, who is basically the proto NHS, right? He's a doctor who works for free.
Maybe do favorite lines?
Sure. I hate to say it, but can I read a favorite paragraph?
Yeah.
All right. It's the opening. It's the first paragraph. It's, to my mind, one of the best first paragraphs I've ever seen, and maybe the best first paragraph I've ever seen. All right, here it is. London. Michaelmas term lately over, and the Lord Chancellor sitting in Lincoln's Inn Hall. Implacable November weather. As much mud in the streets as if the waters had but newly retired from the face of the earth, and it would not be wonderful to meet a megalosaurus 40 feet long or so, waddling like an elephantine lizard up Holborn Hill, smoke lowering down from the chimney pots, making a soft black drizzle with flakes of soot in it as big as full-grown snowflakes. Gone into mourning, one might imagine, for the death of the sun. Dogs indistinguishable in mire. Horses scarcely better. splashed to their very blinkers. Foot passengers jostling one another's umbrellas in a general infection of ill temper and losing their foothold at street corners, where tens of thousands of other foot passengers have been slipping and sliding since the day broke, if day ever broke, adding new deposits to the crust upon crust of mud, sticking at those points tenaciously to the pavement, and accumulating at compound interest.
It's an incredible paragraph. I mean, opening. Just
it's
incredible.
The whole book in a weird way. I mean, this is
in
kind
a
of
weird
why I
way,
keep on
yeah.
going back to property. It's like compound interest. In any event.
Compound interest is brought up quite a few times in this, which I appreciated. I was like, how you can't compound what you don't have. That's an interesting point.
Exactly.
I will say mine is very short. But injustice breeds injustice. The fighting with shadows and being defeated by them necessitates the setting up of substances to combat. I thought that
say that
was
one more time. Can you say that more time?
But injustice breeds injustice. The fighting with shadows and being defeated by them necessitates the setting up of substances to combat.
What's your take on that, briefly?
I mean, I felt like whenever we were just talking about, how kind of Richard wasted his life, and I'll hurry, Laura, I'm sorry. He kind of wasted his life
right.
trying to fight for justice and became kind of unjust in himself. I think the point is, like, everything gets so complicated because, you have this sort of faulty system that once you're in it, like I can't speak well. Once you're in this kind of faulty system, you have to keep getting into it and set up more rules that further complicate the issues to sort of combat the problems that you encountered. And it becomes this giant
it takes on a power of its own
quagmire of the justice system, which is imperfect. And that's the problem with it. It can never be, you can't add enough rules and laws and tiny clauses to make it perfect. It just becomes unmanageable at that point.
Maybe you should speak to, Nancy Pelosi or a couple of people in Congress about that.
Tell them to read the Bleak House.
Yeah, really. You should do that. That's good. Okay, I'm just going to read something short. The view from my Lady Deadlock's own windows is alternately a lead-colored view and a view in Indian ink, which I find fascinating. Anyway, the vases on the stone terrace in the foreground catch the rain all day, and the heavy drops fall, drip, 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 upon the broad flagged pavement called from old time the Ghost's Walk all night. But I just love that. Alternately a lead-colored view and a view in Indian ink. Fascinating.
Yeah, you kind of get that caged feeling again. This beautiful cage that she's
in. Yeah.
I highly recommend whoever is out there reading it, because I think it's one of the better ones. If you read Great Expectations in high school or junior high school or whatever, and you hated it, this is not like that. It's totally different.
There are many scholars who think it's his best work.
I want to read more by him.